Welcome back to another explainer. If you've been to a grocery store recently, you've probably noticed two incredibly frustrating things. First, the prices are just climbing higher every single month, right? And second, the produce somehow tastes a little more bland every year. Well, today, we are exploring a truly fascinating agricultural and philosophical framework that actually attempts to solve exactly that problem. We're going to unpack the Planned Abundance Eden Protocols, which are derived from the writings of Marcus Heinrich Rackbach. This isn't just a tweak to the current system. It's a complete reimagination of how humanity interacts with the Earth. We're talking about a massive shift away from traditional industrialized farming and toward a self-regenerating, highly productive form of ecosystem management. Okay, let's dive right into this.
All right, here is our roadmap for today. First up, the Sissy fusion farming crisis. Second, return to a vegan Eden. Third, caretakers, not exploitative farmers. From there, we'll look at pyrolysis and the Milpa system, move right along to designing a food forest, and finally wrap the whole thing up with local food security achieved.
The source text presents a really comprehensive system called the Eden Protocols. The core argument here is that we basically need to completely transform how we interact with the land. Instead of fighting nature with heavy machinery and dumping synthetic chemicals everywhere, the protocols outline a generative, no-till approach to soil management. And what's incredibly appealing about this framework is the idea of designing a lifestyle with minimum work but maximum benefit. For millennia, agriculture has basically been synonymous with backbreaking labor. But this system, it's built upon a continuous, effortless recycling of natural resources that eventually makes external inputs and endless physical toil entirely unnecessary. It's pretty wild.
Section 1. The Sissy fusion farming crisis. Let's begin by examining what the author sees as the absolute fundamental flaw in modern agriculture.
The text describes our current petrochemical farming system as a Sisyphusian dilemma. This is a direct reference to the Greek myth of Sisyphus, the guy cursed to push a massive boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it roll right back down. The author argues that continuous plowing and tilling literally destroys the natural, complex microorganisms in the soil. To compensate for this dead, depleted dirt, modern agriculture relies heavily on artificial, petrochemical fertilizers just to force crops to grow. And the resulting produce is what the author bluntly calls plastic food. Honestly, if you've ever bitten into a standard supermarket tomato in the dead of winter, you kind of have to agree. It often tastes a lot more like the plastic container it came in than actual food, right? They're grown in this sterile medium, totally lacking true nutritional density, and they're completely dependent on these endless chemical inputs.
Section 2. Return to a vegan Eden. So, to solve this crisis, the author introduces a massive paradigm shift.
According to the Eden Protocols, returning to a vegan Eden means abandoning animal exploitation entirely. The text posits that a true paradise basically requires universal nonviolence toward all sentient beings. The author draws on biblical metaphors, arguing that before humanity was forced to toil with the plow as a punishment, we were simply caretakers of an absolutely abundant garden. But here's the thing, it's not just a moral or ethical stance for the author, it's a highly practical one. By insisting on a fully plant-based vegan lifestyle, the protocols completely eliminate the intensive labor, the massive resource drain, and the immense ecological damage associated with animal agriculture.
Section 3. Caretakers, not exploitative farmers. And this brings us right to how this philosophy actively changes our day-to-day actions. The author asks us to completely reimagine these two words. We absolutely need to transition from being exploitative farmers to being caretaker gardeners. Think of modern farming as an act of extraction. It's almost like mining. It's literally a war against nature, requiring constant mechanical and chemical intervention. I want you to think of the soil as a living, breathing, incredibly complex underground city. Every time a plow comes through, it essentially bulldozes that entire city, exposing it to oxygen, which volatilizes the organic matter and completely kills off the inhabitants. Gardening, on the other hand, at least in the context of the Eden Protocols, means utilizing self-regenerating no-till ecosystems. Instead of bulldozing that underground city, caretakers leave the soil surface entirely intact, nurturing and feeding the incredible biological complexity underground.
Section 4. Pyrolysis and the Milpa system. Let's look at the highly specific, historical agricultural techniques we can actually apply to make this happen.
So here is the big question. If modern farming is a trap that leaves future generations with a massive ecological deficit, how exactly do the protocols suggest we restore these barren, chemical-soaked soils? How do we put fertility back into the earth without relying on synthetic fertilizers?
The text points to the ancient Milpa system as a primary solution.
This was used historically by indigenous populations in places like South America, and this method actually leaves the land more fertile for future generations than it was originally, which is amazing. Instead of the highly destructive slash-and-burn agriculture we always hear about today, the Milpa system used a highly controlled rotational cycle spanning anywhere from 70 to 100 years, and that timeline is absolutely crucial. This isn't about rushing to hit a quarterly yield, it's a multi-generational promise to the land, allowing it to deeply heal and regenerate over decades between uses. By mimicking these ancient practices, the author outlines exactly how we can live off the interest of our soil capital rather than constantly depleting the principal. Think of modern chemical farming kind of like living off high-interest credit cards. It offers a really quick fix, but eventually the debt comes due and you're left totally bankrupt. The Milpa system, on the other hand, literally builds a physical trust fund right there in the ground. Because the soil isn't constantly turned over and disturbed, a thriving ecosystem of microorganisms just naturally establishes itself. You are living off the compounding interest of that biological bank account, and that completely eliminates the need for artificial fertilizers, creating a true self-sustaining cycle of permanent fertility.
Now, the real core mechanism behind this deep regeneration is something called pyrolysis. And to be clear, this isn't just your standard campfire where you burn wood all the way down to white powdery ash that just blows away in the wind. Pyrolysis is a very specific, smothered burning process that retains the dense carbon structure of the biomass, creating what is known as biochar. This biochar acts almost like a microscopic sponge in the soil. It absorbs and holds on to nutrients, it locks in moisture, and it provides the absolute ultimate safe habitat for beneficial bacteria and microbial life to thrive. Plus, as an added bonus, it effectively locks carbon into the soil for hundreds of years, keeping it totally out of the atmosphere.
Sequentially, the protocols pair this pyrolysis with mycoforestry. This is a term coined by the famous researcher Paul Stamets, and mycoforestry is basically the deliberate cultivation of fungi within a forest system. The author beautifully describes fungi as the teeth of the forest. I love that imagery, because without fungi, a fallen tree or dead plant matter might just sit on the forest floor, slowly rotting away for decades. But by inoculating logs or compost with specific fungal spores, you are totally supercharging the decomposition process. They literally digest the wood, rapidly breaking down the organic matter and recycling those absolutely crucial elements straight back into the living soil's food web.
Section 5. Designing a food forest. This is where all these techniques, the no-till gardening, the biochar, and the mycoforestry finally come together into one beautiful system. The author explains that we actually don't have to wait centuries for a natural forest to slowly emerge. We can intelligently orchestrate the steps of natural forest succession to fast-track a plot of land into a highly productive food forest. Let's walk through this journey step by step. First, you start with tough pioneer plants, what the author cleverly calls designer weeds. These are super rugged plants that can survive in heavily degraded, essentially dead soil, and they literally pull nitrogen straight from the air. In step 2, once those pioneers have done their heavy lifting, you plant legume ground covers to start building up physical soil structure and retaining moisture. Moving to step 3, as the soil continues to heal, you introduce support plants and a shrubby understory, which creates shaded, highly protected microclimates. And finally, in step 4, you introduce your endgame crops, a climax state of diverse canopy trees, nut trees, and perennial fruits. And the best part? Once this climax state is fully established, it requires almost zero maintenance to absolutely thrive.
Section 6. Local food security achieved. So what is the tangible, real-world result of all this careful ecosystem orchestration?
By combining all these methods, the text argues that communities can achieve genuine, completely bulletproof local food security. Because a mature food forest develops this incredibly deep, sponge-like layer of humus, it naturally retains massive amounts of water, making it extremely drought-resistant. It continually pulls carbon right out of the atmosphere. But honestly, most importantly, it addresses an anxiety so many of us share today: supply chain fragility. I mean, recent global events have clearly shown us that grocery store shelves can empty out alarmingly fast. The Eden Protocols aim to create a system of true planned abundance that is completely independent of the global petrochemical grid. If those global supply chains fail, a mature food forest just continues to produce massive, reliable yields year after year, offering genuine self-sufficiency for a community. The protocols leave us with a really profound choice regarding our role on this planet. It asks us to look very closely at the very foundation of how we interact with the natural world. Are we destined to constantly bulldoze and deplete the earth, fighting it endlessly with synthetic chemicals and heavy machinery? Or can we learn to deeply orchestrate natural systems, build incredibly rich biological capital, and finally step into our role as caretaker gardeners. The next time you walk through a grocery store, ask yourself, are we permanently trapped in the sisyphusian cycle of extraction, or is it time we finally return to the garden? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, everyone. See you next time.